Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Alicia Diaz.
It's 2001, and I'm at my papi Felix, my grandfather's house. It was an ordinary family get-together, and at that point, my abuelo was very frail. He had already lost one leg to phlebitis. We were afraid he might lose the other, and he was bound to a wheelchair. At some point, he wheeled over to me and motioned for me to join him in another room that was empty. So I followed him, and before I could ask him, like, "Oye, papi, are you all right? Is there something that you need?" He looked at me and he asked me, "Is there ever going to be any justice for my boy?" And for my boy, he was referring to my father. Now, I have absolutely no memory of my grandfather ever saying my father's name out loud. I think it was because it was just simply too painful for him. In 1972, my father was murdered. He was garroted or strangled to death, and his body was thrown away into the Detroit River, which would be his cemetery for several weeks until he floated downriver and was found. It would be my grandfather, amongst other members of the family, that would go to identify him. I don't think you can be a Detroiter and not have a personal relationship with the river we share with Canada. For me, it's been a place where romantic lunches began at noon and they lasted till dawn. It's been where I've had intimate conversations with perfect strangers where we could talk about things that I think neither they nor I could talk about with the people who knew us the best. It's been a place for serenity. It's been a place of beauty. But for me, sooner or later, if I'm walking along those riverbanks, it drifts into my consciousness that that river was a witness to my father's death. I have no memory of my father. Although I was 9 when he died, but my parents divorced when I was a toddler. So I created memories of him out of family stories and out of family photographs. And every so often, I think I would also do like imaginary conversations with him that I would have in my mind about what would we say to each other when I eventually would see him face to face. But shortly before he was murdered, I was in the car one morning with my mother. She was taking me to school, and the traffic was really heavy that morning on Michigan Avenue as we were on our way downtown. And at some point, as she was waiting in traffic, my mother glanced out the side window, and then she turned and looked at me and said very quietly, "Alicia, I think that's your father standing at the bus stop on the other side of the street." And I don't remember responding to her, but what I do remember is being too afraid to look in that direction. And in hindsight, I think part of it might have been that I thought somehow I was betraying my grandfather. We lived with my maternal grandparents, and I absolutely adored my mother's father, and I called him Daddy. And also, I think there was maybe a part of me that resented the fact that, at least within my own living memory at that time, I didn't remember my father ever coming to see me. My mother was able to keep the most horrific details of my father's death away from me. This is a time way before social media and the internet. However, through word of mouth in the barrio, news about my father's death spread like wildfire. And I would learn years later that in places like supermarket lines and barbershops, telephone calls with the cord connected, or in people's living rooms, that there was a lot of chisme and speculation about what happened. And questions were being asked like, what had he been into? Who would hate him that much to kill him that way? I mean, if you wanted to just get rid of somebody, you could have just shot him and been done with it. But whoever did this wanted it to be slow. This was personal. They wanted it to be in a way that he died knowing he was about to die. And so I think even, once I learned the details of it, and by that point I was in my early teens, I didn't actually mourn my father because we didn't have that emotional bond that you have when you're raised by a parent. But inside of me, I deeply resented the fact that it was as if with his death he became invisible. There was nothing left of him, there was no trial, and it was as if he just simply had vanished. And I also regretted the fact that all those conversations I had dreamt about, they were now silenced. So in some ways, I think even perhaps I was complicit in him becoming invisible because I tucked away those feelings that I had in my heart, and I rarely even said his name out loud, even to immediate family members, much less those outside of our family. Growing up in Detroit in the 1970s, as the child of an African-American mother and a Puerto Rican father, that was, as we would say, esto estaba complicado. It was complicated. In my grandparents' home, that was Mississippi and Alabama. It was my grandmother's biscuits, no recipe, done all by hand. It was her phrases, such as she would say sometimes, when I'm just a Baptist born, and when I'm a Baptist born, Baptist bred, and when I'm gone, I'm just a Baptist dead. And on the stereo was Johnny Lee Hooker and B.B. King and Muddy Waters. But my mother saw to it that even though my father was not present in our home, that Puerto Rico was there too. So that same stereo, there was Hector Lavoe, and there was Tito Puente, and there was Celia Cruz, and it was all there. And my mother also insisted that I learn how to speak Spanish. Now, with a child's stubbornness, anytime your parent insists on something, of course, you start to rebel. And I remember one day my mother looked at me when I was complaining about having to take, to add another class onto my schedule, and she said, Alicia, one day you're gonna want to understand all that you are. And part of that is your Puerto Rican-ness. And I think so that you can have all of that, you need to learn how to at least understand, but you should speak Spanish. And I really didn't have much of a retort because my mother was fluent in Spanish. And she actually learned to speak it before she had met my father. It would take me, but when I was in that home, all of my identity was all there, it was knit together. But when I stepped outside of that door, I became chameleon-like. And invisibility would become a central part of my identity. I was educated in Southwest Detroit, which is our city's barrio. And so when I was there, every day, I was surrounded by Latinidad. However, it was a Latinidad that did not look or sound like me because most of our community was Mexicano. So to be honest, I learned how to do a ranchera and a cumbia before I could even do a halfway decent salsa. And I have to tell you that many days I think I had more homemade menudo or tamales and other traditional Mexican dishes than arroz con gandules. But within that, when I was within the barrio, there were many times that I felt my Puerto Rican-ness was invisible because if I was walking down the street, not saying anything, even in bad Spanish, to anyone, or if I didn't have something on my clothing that had the Puerto Rican flag on it, and for those of you who know Puerto Ricans, there's always a flag somewhere. It's in a bag, it's somewhere. And it's somewhere. Come on now, there's some Puerto Ricans here, got a flag, there's one in the corner. But it's not just adornment, it's part of our history because there was a time on the island in the 1940s and 50s where the United States government made owning or displaying a Puerto Rican flag a crime. So for Boricuas to have that flag, it's a form of resilience. But if I didn't have that on or open my mouth to someone, walking down the street, I looked like the majority of Detroiters. I was another African-American sister. But that another part of me seemed to fade away. Now, when I stepped outside the barrio, that same Puerto Rican-ness still remained invisible because now I've stepped out into the larger community and now What do I look like? That same African-American sister. Until, for example, someone would ask me my name, or they would say my name and it would be mispronounced, and I would tell people I am not Alicia or Diaz, that it was Alicia Diaz. And then there would usually be a circle of questions like, oh, so where did you get that name from? Or as I became older, sometimes people would assume, oh, is that your husband's name? It couldn't have been mine. But there were times when my Puerto Ricanness would be visible within the larger community, that there would be consequences. I can remember during my freshman year in college at Wayne State University, I had participated in some kind of student fundraiser and we were selling tacos. And so I'm standing behind the table and I have on a Puerto Rican t-shirt. It's got the flag, it's got the, Puerto Rico up underneath. And two young women walk up to the table. They appeared to be two young African-American sisters. And I noticed as they got closer to the table, one of them started looking pretty intently at my t-shirt. And her face went from friendly to not. And by the time she walked up, before I could ask her what was your order, she looked at me and said, "What are you doing wearing that t-shirt?" And my head went back and I said, "Because it's mine." But then it was also, I said, but also it was like, because this is who I am. That's me. And she looked at me dead in my face and said, "Oh no, because everybody knows those people are white and you're not." And I remember like taking this deep breath and saying, "Sister, do you know that boat that left the African continent? It made a lot of stops. And Puerto Rico was one of them before it landed here in the United States." And her face changed. She was embarrassed. And her friend that was with her kind of tugged her away. They didn't buy any tacos. But as they left, first I'm looking at them with major attitude, but also there was a part of me inside that said, why didn't I tell her my mother was African American? It would take me a long time to knit together all the pieces of my identity. It would take leaving, traveling outside of Detroit, not only through the United States, but also in Latin America, and going overseas. Until I got to a place where no matter where I was or who I was with, everything was, the entirety of me would be on display. I shed invisibility. It was no longer, it was like, this is it, I don't need that. But there would come a time when I think I might have given almost anything to have been invisible again. In the spring of 2014, one afternoon, I had gotten off a call with my attorney, who was telling me to prepare myself that because myself, along with my former business partners, we were probably going to be the lead story on the 6 p.m. news, and followed up with the 11 o'clock news, and that more than likely we would make the front page of either the Detroit Free Press and News, or maybe both of them. This was concerning my former company's role in at that time, the expanding federal investigation into former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick and the pay-to-play scandal. And I can tell you that 15 minutes, or it was longer than that, of media coverage and in print was enough to last me for 3 lifetimes. But I can tell you that how I craved invisibility. But even once that week passed with that media coverage, the desire to be invisible went on for months. Because every time I stepped outside of that door, I wondered, this is Detroit, it's hard to step out of your front door and not know somebody. What was going to be the response of people? Was it going to be the same as it was, to greet me with warmth? Would someone look at me and then turn their head? And you know that look where people want you to see them turn their head, so they want you to know you're being dismissed? Or was it simply going to be someone who would confront me about what they had heard in the media? So for me, now I wanted invisibility, and it was nowhere to be had, except at home, where for months, in addition to an extended unemployment, I binge watched really bad science fiction on the Sci-Fi Channel. One day I got a phone call from my comadre, who, by the way, she's here tonight. She's sitting in the back, Esther Galvez. And a comadre, for all of you out here who don't understand that term, this is more than your BFF. This is your sister from another mother, but more importantly, this is someone that if you have children and something should happen to you, that's the person you would expect to step up and see to it that your children and be there for them to become the people that she knew you would have wanted them to become. And she called not only to interrupt my binge watching, but also to talk about a story. And this was a story she had brought up a number of times over the years. And frankly, I had always blown her off as being, I was too busy. And the story was about a period in her life that extended for about 5 years, when during the 1980s, she was an immigration advocate. And she worked with Salvadoreños and Guatemaltecos, who during that period had fled Central America. In the 1980s, the civil wars in Central America had risen to the level of being genocidal. And hundreds of thousands of them had come over the border into the United States, many of them without documentation. But there was virtually no political asylum to be had here in the United States. Sounds familiar? Many of them, though, knew that there was the opportunity in Canada. So they would find their way to northern border cities like Detroit. And there, people like my comadre, where she worked with dozens upon dozens of men, women, and children to give them that opportunity for freedom and security. She was not interested in an autobiography about herself at all. But for decades, she had anguished about the lives and the stories of the people she had worked with, because to her, it seemed they had just simply faded from Detroit history. She lived with the memories of children that were so traumatized by war that they came to the shelter where she worked mute, of men crippled by guilt of being unable to protect their families from militias and the military, and of women who had endured gang rape and violence while their children watched and they hoped that maybe they would stop with them. She lived with those memories, and it was those stories that she wanted to be told. And she finished up the conversation saying, you know, I'm just wondering, are you still too busy? Do you have time now? It was from that challenge, there was the idea of a story, and eventually it would become what it is now, the beginnings of a working version of a feature-length documentary called Dangerous Times, Rebellious Responses, which for me is a space I never could have imagined when I was desiring invisibility that I would ever be in. It's probably even more surprising because to this day, I still can't even take a decent picture with my cell phone. So to end up working on a documentary, thank goodness I've had the ability to work with amazingly talented people for whom there is that craft. But aside from me taking those steps to become a storyteller, it also has allowed me to look at the Detroit River very differently. Because in the 19th century, as we know as Detroiters, when African Americans fled bondage out of slavery and they came to Detroit and they came to that last stop known as midnight, some of the last things they did was to stand at the banks of the Detroit River because they knew when they crossed over into Canada that they would be free. And in the 20th century, Central Americans would follow another underground railroad, again to Detroit. And one of the last things they would do was stand by the river before they crossed into Canada and into their freedom. So by working on this project, it's not only the honor of being able to tell those stories, but it has allowed me to look at the river as a place that has represented both African American and Latinx identities. But perhaps more importantly, I don't just look at the river now as a place of death. It's a place of life. And that's what it's been. You know, I currently serve as an instructor in Latinx studies at Wayne State University. I'm very honored that a number of our students are here this evening. And one of the things that I do with my students is to impress upon them that history is not just about the rich and the powerful or the famous or those that have so many hits on Instagram. It's about ordinary people. And it's also about who tells the story of those ordinary people. So for example, to talk about them doing family narrative, I share with them a story from my family about my twice great maternal grandmother, who was born in slavery in the Mississippi Delta. But shortly before the end of her life, in the end of the 1930s, she was interviewed as part of the WPA Slave Narrative Project. So because of that narrative, we know her story, but it's about how her story was told. So for example, her story opens up where she is described as being a, quote, typical black mammy. She is not once in her narrative described by the honorific of Mrs. So you have a white woman as the interviewer in Jim Crow, Mississippi, taking down her story. But despite being interviewed by someone who is looking at her through the prism of racism and stereotype, you hear who she was. She talks about, being required of those that were owned by their master, of having to go to the white church on Sunday and sit in the back. But she says in her narrative that that wasn't worship, that they sat quietly, and then after they were dismissed, that they went back to the quarters, and she said, and that's when we had real church. And she talked about saying that she said, white folks just do not know how to worship. And she talked about the joy and the singing and the music of those few moments that they had where they could be people. She talks about a failed love affair, where there was a man who was after her for quite a while, and he had asked her several times to marry him, and she kept putting him off, figuring that this would be on her timetable. She said until one day, he just left with another gal. I think about the fact that, by the time she was interviewed, she was in her 70s, and here she was talking about a love affair from probably 50 years earlier. And we suspect he might have been the love of her life because she did not marry even in the 19th century until she was almost 40. But at the end of her narrative, she talks about being the last in her community, which was Delo, Mississippi, of having living memory of being someone's property. But she also talks about waiting to die. I use that narrative as a way to explain to my students of why their family stories matter. One time I'd given the assignment for one of my students to go and talk to an elder, if not in their immediate family, in their community, or someone that they knew and respected. And one of my students decided to go speak to her grandfather. And so when she went to go talk to her abuelo, at first he rejected the idea. And she kept after him saying, mira, abuelo, I got to do this homework assignment. I need your help. But finally he said to her, listen, why would anybody at a university be interested in the story of a poor person like me? So she came back and she told me what he had said, and I told her, I said, please tell your abuelo this message, that I'm the child of poor people and slaves, and that their stories matter, and that I would like to hear his story. She went back and told him. They spent hours talking about a life she never knew existed, and she learned about how he came from rural Mexico with virtually no education, no money, but a dream, and made his way to the United States and finally to Michigan, and he laid the foundations for his granddaughter to sit in a university classroom. I share my family stories with my students to remind them that we cannot allow people like him to be invisible. We cannot. When my grandfather had asked me, was there ever going to be any justice for my boy, I really didn't have a good answer for him. I vaguely remember saying something along the lines that there was a bigger justice. But I'd like to think that the real justice for my father, Jose Vidal Diaz Ofaril, and for my grandfather, Felix Diaz Betancourt, is the fact that my father is no longer invisible, because you've heard about him tonight. And that my grandfather, who couldn't find peace before he joined the ancestors, that maybe he's resting a little easier too, knowing that you know about his boy. I don't consider myself necessarily a rebel. I don't think I've done anything to deserve that title. But I'd like to think that by stepping into storytelling space, that I'm able to tell the stories of people like those you've already heard tonight and will hear with Adonis here as to close out this evening that are. Thank you.
Alicia Diaz.